We are going to talk about something which is very, very much misunderstood in Christianity. And from the very beginning, it might even seem to be heretics, something like heresy, but don't judge right away, okay? Study it for yourself, and only after that make decisions. I'll be talking about two covenants. That's the theme which we have for several weeks already. And we know that a covenant was done at the Mount Sinai, and a covenant was done at the cross. And to start talking about those two covenants again, I have to have a little picture here on the screen first. And by each element of that picture, I will explain things, hopefully. And hopefully my computer will allow me to do what I would like to do. So this is the timeline. It's our time, the time where we live. So, and of course, our time had the beginning when we were created in Adam. That's the beginning. And that time will have the continuation, of course, but right now it doesn't have any ending yet. And also, I will need to put on that timeline where we are. That's at the very end already. Oh, that's kind of complicated here. I don't know why this is happening. Well, basically, I do know. Okay, so here we are, like this. Okay, so the coming of Jesus is pretty close to our time. It's really close. And between this piece of the picture and that piece of the picture, we have about 6,000 years. Let's continue with the picture. We will need something else on that picture. 1 second, maybe I'll make it that way. We need the Mount Sinai, don't you think? Yes, absolutely, the Mount Sinai. It happened about 2,000 years after the creation of the world. So I'll try to put it correctly. And we know that before the Mount Sinai, the flood happened, the Tower of Babel happened, the birth and life of Moses happened, Isaac happened, and the Jewish nation got started from those people, and eventually Egypt for the Jewish people, Egypt for the Hebrew people happened, and now we have the Mount Sinai. We also need to have here the cross. And it happened about 2,000 years after the Mount Sinai. And of course, that's the main event, not only for our planet, it is the main event for the whole universe. Though it happened here on our planet, it had everything to do with the whole universe. And what else do we need? We need this one, here, which will kind of connect for us the Mount Sinai and the cross. All right. And one more thing. Between that event before, between the Mount Sinai and the cross, we have the tabernacle and the temple. The tabernacle was done exactly at the time when the Jewish people received the law at that mount. And the temple happened when David decided to make something for the Lord to live in, how he said it in his speech. But David could not do it. The Lord did not allow him to do it. Solomon, his son, built a temple for God. And we know that that temple was destroyed once, and then it was rebuilt again, and it was destroyed one more time. The rebuilt one, destroyed one more time. Eventually, we have a very interesting picture here. We have a picture when the temple and the tabernacle existed, and it took about 2,000 years approximately for the existence of those buildings. And we have about 2,000 years before the Mount Sinai, when nothing like that existed. And we have about 2,000 years after the cross, when something like that does not exist. So it's very strange, isn't it? If it was so important for God, for the tabernacle and for the temple to exist, he would make sure that it would exist all the time, everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. But we come to a picture when it existed and it ceased to exist. And we have all the rights to ask why. Why would it happen? And the answer is very simple. Look carefully. At the Mount Sinai, we have a very large event which signifies the beginning of the Hebrew nation. Before, they would not be considered as a nation. They would be considered as the people who came from Abraham, and they lived in captivity in Egypt. And yes, it was kind of a nation, but it still was not, because for a nation, you have to have your own language, which they did. You have to have your own law, which they basically had, but it was very problematic at the time when they were coming out of Egypt. And you have to have your own land, which they did not have. Yes, of course, it was promised for them to have the land of Canaan, but they still did not have it. So it was not a nation yet. But when they came to the Mount Sinai, they almost got it all. Of course, they had the language, they got the law, they got completely the monarch, the king, which was God at that time. And they were going to the promised land, which would be their land. So we have birth of the nation here. And of course, the Lord promised that it would be born and everything would be Fine, but there was a problem at the Mount Sinai, a huge problem. That nation was not born according to the plan. The plan which God had was that each one in that nation would allow God to abide in him and in her and make that nation a place where God is presented in the people. They refused. That's why God had to go to the plan B. And the plan B still was to abide amongst the Hebrew nation, but in his own tabernacle. And God did it. They built a tabernacle for him, and it was very significant. They gathered everything which they took out of the land of Egypt, all that gold, precious stones, everything which they brought out of there, and they built the tabernacle of those things. And then we read the story of the Hebrew nation, and it is a story of complete failing to be obedient to the Lord. And when David promotes the idea of building a temple, God does not resist, because it is still plan B. The people do not allow God to abide in them. That's why God has to abide in some kind of structural thing. The temple is built, and again, a problem struck, which they always had. The Hebrew nation always thought, believed, and taught that the main idea of having the tabernacle or the temple, it was the idea, and it was the plan A for each one of them, for the whole nation. They were praying basically not to God, they were praying to the tabernacle, to the temple, to the things in them, to the stones in them. They were doing things for them, and they were always forgetting that God was the main one. That's why all those heathen gods were entering the nation, and eventually they started entering even the temple. That's why God destroyed the temple. God did not care for that temple at all, because he allowed the tabernacle and the temple to exist only because of one reason, for only one reason: to have in that nation, in those amongst the people, an illustration, a symbol of how it had to be if it were for true, if it were the plan A. So the Christianity right now makes the same mistake what the Hebrew nation made. The Christianity says that it was some kind of miraculous thing, and that's how everybody was forgiven. All those, the system of sacrifices and all that stuff. That's how everybody was forgiven, they would say. But after the cross, we are forgiven differently. We have the forgiveness from different source. So the tabernacle and the temple was the first source, and it did not kind of work somehow. So God decided to change the plan and do a different way of forgiveness. Complete nonsense. and we will see it eventually. But before, we need to realize that every time when we start thinking about the tabernacle, what was about, how it was organized, what was inside, and how it was done, and how it could be moved from place to place. Every time when we think about the temple and study what it consisted of, we need to understand that it was an illustration of how God saves all of us. It was an illustration about Christ himself, what he does, how he does, and where we are in this place, and what we to do in this place. So we basically, like reading and studying those two structures, reading and studying the way of salvation. People may ask, how can it be, if you, Sasha, are right, how can it be that the way of salvation kind of is different? No, it's not different at all. That's exactly the same. Let me put another piece of the picture here. The way of salvation is the everlasting covenant. And we studied that idea for a pretty long time. Everlasting means that it exists always. And the gospel is called everlasting. So you see, it exists always. And that's the only salvation. The only salvation. If you want to be saved, you should be in that place here, in the everlasting covenant. And that way of salvation kicked to be, sorry, my English, it started right away when the sin happened. When did it happen? It happened at the very beginning, and the plan started at the very beginning, right here. Right here. When Adam and his wife sinned, God made sure that his word is sacrificed right away. Why? Because if it weren't sacrificed, Adam and his wife had to die. The word said you have to die. So God sacrificed his own word in order for Adam and his wife to continue living and to have a choice to join back, to come back to that covenant, which is the everlasting covenant. Glory to the Lord, they did come back. How? By faith. That's how they existed in that covenant before the fall. And that's how they came back to that covenant. The only difference was that the covenant worked out the sacrifice here. Otherwise, they would not be able to come back. Once you broke with the everlasting covenant, you are dead. Because the life is in the everlasting covenant. So God had to do the substitution. He substituted Adam, the humanity, on the lamb, and the word is killed, sacrificed. That's how the humanity can still exist and make choice. Either you continue with this humanity which is fallen, or you can choose the everlasting covenant and you continue with the everlasting covenant. Make sure we understand, let's make sure we understand that that sacrifice goes along the way all the time. It works everywhere. It works everywhere. It never stopped working. Otherwise, we had to be killed. The word was sacrificed. Yes, we know that eventually the word will be resurrected somewhere over here. And that's gonna be complicated for that line here, down here, because the resurrected word it says if you sinned, you got to be killed, and everybody will be killed, and the whole flesh, fallen flesh, will be destroyed. Everything will be destroyed. The rage of God against the sin and the fallen flesh will be here on this earth. But everybody who used the sacrifice will be saved, because they joined through that sacrifice, they joined the everlasting covenant. So they are saved. Those who did not choose the sacrifice, yes, they live their lives and they die. So let's continue with this idea. We know that that sacrifice, which happened at the very beginning, right away, that sacrifice was done completely and perfectly in the human flesh on the cross. So God basically took our flesh, which is this line here. He became sin for each one of us. He took all the dirt of the world upon himself, and he brought the dirt to the death. That's how his sacrifice was ratified. I don't know, I hope it's the right English word. So ratification of his sacrifice happened, but let's understand that everyone who lived before the cross was saved exactly the same way as everyone who lives after the cross, through the sacrifice, connecting to the everlasting covenant. Let's go back to our picture here in the middle. So what happened to the Hebrew nation was really bad, and Satan made sure it would happen. They did not connect as a nation. They did not connect to the everlasting covenant. They refused as a nation. And God made sure that they still continue existing by reinforcing. It was kind of forceful, I would say, by giving them symbols after symbols after symbols. So eventually they will be able to make it to the very end when the true sacrifice is made for the whole universe and for the earth. The true sacrifice. So Apostle Paul, when he's talking about what happened at the Mount Sinai, says that it was the first covenant. And when he is talking what happened at the cross, he says it was the new covenant. Why is he using those words? Because Jeremiah used them. And those words are only about the Hebrew nation. It was the first time when God tried to bring them to the everlasting covenant. It was the first time, and they refused. That's why Apostle Paul says this is the first covenant. But then God brought this nation to the second time, and he made his everlasting covenant with the nation, and it was the new one comparing to the first one. And I hope we understand that each one who accepted Christ at the very beginning was a Hebrew. Jesus himself was a Hebrew. So what they failed to do at the Mount Sinai from the first time, Jesus made sure to happen 2000 later at the cross. And he actually made that everlasting covenant with those Hebrews who believed in him. That's how Apostle Paul says that's the new one. That's the new covenant. Why is it new? Because of course this one is old and this one is new. And it's everything here is about the everlasting covenant. Now let's see. What's about the tabernacle and the temple? Of course, they were designed to explain to the Hebrew people how they are being saved, what God does for them, what's happening in the heavenly sanctuary. And each one of them who would be recipient to the Holy Spirit talking would be able to understand the main ideas of that everlasting covenant, would be able to understand it. You see? This is very important to understand also. God did not allow his people to perish completely. He started working with each one separately, with each one. For example, Moses always was in the everlasting covenant. Yes, Brother Chris.
Sister Sasha?
Oh, yes, Sister Didra.
I'm sorry, I've been fighting for the past 20 minutes to get through. Dan's on the phone in the living room now, so I can speak. Mm-hmm. When you said earlier that the tabernacle was a different kind of forgiveness, I don't know if you should have or shouldn't have, so I don't want to appear to correct you, but you failed to mention that the tabernacle was symbolic of salvation and the coming of Christ, and that the same forgiveness comes from God. It didn't come from a different source. Yes, he used the sanctuary to express his forgiveness, but it's important to remember that though it was coming from the source of the temple as opposed to the cross, it was still coming from the Lord himself and Jesus.
Basically, that's what I'm talking about. Maybe my English did not really come well through, but I'm thankful that you talked about it. It's better English right now. Yes, of course.
I didn't mean to make you feel insecure about your English.
Right. Yeah. Yes, of course. What I was talking about, the idea that the Christians right now, they think that before God was forgiving people from the tabernacle and the temple, and from the sacrifices which those people were doing before the tabernacle came to existence. And this is absolutely incorrect idea, because humans can be forgiven only through the sacrifice of the lamb. And that sacrifice happened right in the Garden of Eden. That's how God forgives each one of us. Okay, very good. So one more idea, and I think we will stop here. Maybe I'll bring a couple of verses here. So if we would like to really understand what righteousness is, what is Jesus's sacrifice completely and perfectly, to understand it in details, if we really want to understand who we are and where we are in the plan of salvation, there is only one way to do it right now for each one of us. It is to study the tabernacle and the temple. They are talking, and let me put it differently, they are yelling about, they are crying aloud about Jesus Christ. And if only the Christianity today knew that, the Christianity would understand the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. I wouldn't say even better. They would understand it, because right now they don't understand it. Otherwise, everybody would be already perfect and righteous completely. So the tabernacle and the temple were allowed by God only as illustrations, not more, nothing more. And if we would like to be saved, we need to be connected through the sacrifice to the everlasting covenant. And next time, I hope we will be able to look at the texts which show us how the connection happens precisely in details. And it is amazing. We in this group know about it, but I would like to put it all together, like the picture itself, so we never will forget that everything is done only by God. And we are connected only by faith. A couple of verses from the Bible before we finish up here. So let the picture be before us. Apostle John writes very interesting things. He says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory." The Word, of course, by the context, we understand he's talking about Jesus. The Word was with God, and it is Jesus, and he became flesh. And it's very interesting. How on earth could it be that the Word, which had to kill those who committed sins, how could it be that that Word became flesh and took upon himself that fallen flesh which should be killed? And how could it be that that Word did not kill anyone? Though it had to. I hope we understand each other. because the word said, you eat from that fruit, you die the same day. How could it be? Easily. It's because that word was already sacrificed 4,000 years ago in our lifetime here, in our time frame here. It was sacrificed. So that word did not kill anyone. It came to save all of us. He came to save, he, because the word is a person, a God, a person from Godhead. He was sacrificed, and he came by taking our fallen flesh upon himself. And those who testified about him, they all of them say, we saw that he was God. He behaved as he was God, and that God was amazing because he was love. He preferred to be sacrificed, but not kill anyone. Absolutely wonderful. And it's very interesting that that word, it says dwelt among us. But if we go to the Greek, it basically says it tabernacled amongst us. So when Jesus, when Christ became Jesus, when he took our flesh upon himself, he basically became the tabernacle, and he tabernacled amongst all of us. That's what the tabernacle talking about. This picture is talking about Jesus Christ becoming human. Let's continue. The book of Revelation shows us one more interesting picture. It says, and I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. Now, when we know who the tabernacle is, we can understand easily what is said here. Behold, the human form of God is with men. Christ will be abiding with the saved people forever, and he forever will be that tabernacle. Though it will be, of course, already made not from Egyptian stuff, from the fallen nature. He will be made of the heavenly stuff, from that beautiful, glorious nature which God has in the human nature right now. And that human nature, of course, will be given to us also. He will be abiding here on this planet, God in human flesh, right amongst all of us. And he will dwell, that's the same word, tabernacle, with them. And they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. I would like to be there with Jesus Christ, who tabernacles amongst all of us, forever and ever and ever. Can you imagine? This planet will become the center of the universe. Do you realize this idea? Because we know God is the center of the universe. So wherever he is in his complete presence, that place is the center of the universe. I don't know about other people, but I would like to abide in that center. And the humanity is given that privilege. Let's look at one more wonderful passage which will show us how to think about the temple, how to understand what the temple was, like this illustration of the temple. I'll take it from the 2 Corinthians, though we could find it in the Psalms, I believe. It says, God says, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. It's very interesting here, because the word dwell here is not tabernacle. It's just the word which says, I will live in them, I will abide in them. Basically, I will be presented in them. I will be in them. But it's not tabernacling, because he already has his human nature. But this thing tells us how he will be related to the humans. And this is the idea of the temple. So by studying what was in the temple, we will understand how God himself will abide in his people. And this is absolutely gorgeous. The humanity will be a very beautiful, gorgeous, heavenly gorgeous building, which consists of completely different characters, completely different talents, completely different people. It will be a huge amount of people, and each one of them being united together will be the beautiful picture of the temple of God. I don't know, I don't think I have enough English words to talk about it, but I hope you are getting the idea. It's not gonna be a building, it's gonna be something living, united, powerful, wonderful, which the universe itself will be looking to understand who God is. That's our destiny. If we agree to accept the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and to connect to the everlasting covenant, if we agree to give up on the old covenant, and we know the difference between them. The old covenant says you should do this, you should do that, you should do this, you should do that, you should be good, you should be good. That's the old covenant. And it always makes sure that we understand that we cannot do anything. But the everlasting covenant says, believe the word of God and you will be alive. The everlasting covenant exists and can work only on that word believe, on the word faith. If you exercise your faith to believe each word of God, you won't have a problem doing God's will. The problems come only when you fail to believe. That's how the problems come. But if you believe what God says, God will do his word. Because he's God. He always does what he says. Let's stop it here and let's pray.